Hello, everyone. This is Rebecca. I am popping over here for just a minute to give you an update on a couple of really cool things. So, June is my birthday month. Actually, I'm recording this in Barcelona. That was my choice of where to spend my birthday this year. But I'm spending a little bit of time with you because I wanted to come and let you know a few things that I did for myself for my birthday and for all of us, really. And that is to do some major updates to the podcast and to the website. So, first and foremost, to make the podcast a little bit easier to navigate, I went back and renamed the episodes that will now all start with an episode number. So, instead of me saying something like, hey, go back to the podcast I did on such and such, I'll actually be able to go back and reference a specific episode number. The other thing I did was completely renovate my website. This actually took me about a month or so. And I'm finally happy enough to share it with you guys. It's RebeccaTapiaMD.com. And if you go over there, you'll find some more information about me. There's also a tab for the podcast itself where you can find links to Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, where I'm starting to post the podcast, not with video yet, but just if you would prefer to listen to things on YouTube. There's also a spot under that tab if you'd like to come share your story and be a guest on my show, a good way to contact me. I'm also taking the episodes one by one. I've only done 4 so far, but creating blog posts out of them. And that way, if it's a little bit easier for you to go back and just read a summary of the episode or track the episodes or even eventually search the episodes, that's my hope. You're also going to find a store there, and it's really important because that store has a lot of the free downloads. One of the downloads I added just recently was an episode guide that's up through episode 87. So it sorts out which episodes were done by experts, which were stories that we gathered from other people sharing, which are solo episodes, special episodes, etc. So if you've ever wanted a quick reference, I finally have that. So you just add that to the cart and it's free. I've got a couple other free downloads, one which is checking in with what your brain is doing with some of the drama about aging parents. Another download I have is Start Somewhere, which is 5 conversation starters and talking to somebody about their senior years. And then I also have Hospital Quick Tips. That came out of what we talked about in the previous episode, number 87, which was hospital discharges. I also have some merch in there that my kids were big about adding, including a magnet and a tote bag if you'd like to see that. And last but not least, I have finally, you have no idea how much drama I've had in my own head about this, posted 2 courses that I've written and recorded. The first one is free, and that's How to Acknowledge a Zero-Sum Game in Life. That's a 30-minute video accompanied by a 15-page workbook, and that goes step by step through something I've talked about frequently. That was back in episode number 23 about the zero-sum game, and that being one of the biggest components of the drama around aging parents is we only have so much time, attention, etc. So that goes step by step, accompanied by the workbook to help you get through what your zero-sum game looks like. And then also a course. There's a 5-module course I recorded and re-recorded and re-recorded so many times, and my family was so patient with me. And I actually got so much, imposter syndrome or perfectionism that I never published it, or at least never in any way that anybody could find it. And I've sat on it for all this time thinking I'll record it a 4th time and maybe it will be the absolute perfect thing ever. And honestly, I went back and watched it a week or 2 ago and it's great. It's fine. It's everything. I poured my whole brain and heart into how I would want to help somebody through this time in their life, not with a directive, do this, not that, but as a partner saying, let's walk through this. It's very focused on mindset and the mental drama part. And then there's a couple of modules in there that are very practical as far as getting prepared and so forth. So that one is a paid course. It is refundable if you do not find it that helpful. So I appreciate you. I appreciate your support. Please do go over to the website, share it, take all the resources you'd like off the website. Thank you so, so much for being a supporter of the show. And without further ado, here is the episode. Hello, everyone. Before we get started today, I want to come and talk to you about a very exciting thing. So June is my birthday month, and for my birthday, I actually redesigned my own website. So it's still a work in progress, but I am so much happier with it. It was a poorly maintained and very neglected website for a very long time, but yeah, I've been working on it. So if you go there, you can find all sorts of links to the podcast. You can find free downloads. You can join my not so defunct newsletter. And I even started a blog. I'm still working on it, but I'm going to be posting the tidbits and tips from the podcasts. I started a store at my children's behest with some very fashionable merchandise like t-shirts and magnets and socks. And last but not least, I have a course there that I created 2 years ago and never actually published or advertised. I think the course is my best work yet. And I got so much in my own head and so much imposter syndrome and so much doubt that I basically hid the course for 2 years, coming up on exactly 2 years. And I decided, no, I'm actually going to publish and sell the course as I had intended 2 years ago after I went through a course development course. So yes, I took a course about selling courses and created this course. So anyway, if you would like to cruise over and check it out, it's RebeccaTapiaMD.com. Thank you so much. Please leave me some feedback. And without much further delay, here is our podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real Conversations about Aging Parents. This is your host, Rebecca Tapia. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you find this topic interesting. If nothing else, you will probably know more about mobility devices by the end of this podcast than you knew before, whether for yourself or someone else. So I will try to make it as easy as possible. Before we get into the actual devices themselves, let's talk about why mobility is so important. That's the first word, right? Mobility device. So the idea is that these are a set of devices that help people move from one place to the other. And I would distinguish that from other durable medical equipment, such as a bed. So still part of the medical equipment line item, but maybe not so much a bed being used to get somebody from one place to the other. So a mobility device is primarily designed to help ease or improve somebody's ability to move from one space to another. And that would be to improve efficiency of that movement, to improve the safety of that movement, and also to improve the independence of that movement. And so you can think about this in multiple domains. If somebody's using a cane or a walker, then that's helping reduce their reliance on somebody else assisting them and improving their ability to get, say, from a bed to a bathroom at night safely and preventing fall risk. And also just empowering them to be able to make their own determinations about where they want to move and when with the assistance of these devices. That's the big picture umbrella. So that is sort of encapsulating the purpose of these devices. But of course, there's thousands of different versions of these devices, but you can kind of, broadly categorize them into 3 buckets. So one would be wheelchairs. And so anything that has a seat and a set of wheels, and there's all sorts of different kinds of wheelchairs, but we'll just put that bucket there. The next would be walkers. So it tend to have four legs, right? And those plus or minus some wheels on the bottom, and we'll talk more about that. And then last but not least, canes or walking sticks, as they are referred to in some other parts of the country. And we'll get into those. But it is important to kind of think about how somebody progresses through from a wheelchair to a walker to a cane. And when somebody is really debilitated, so after a really long hospital stay and they have trouble getting out of bed, like we don't walk in and hand them a cane. Even if they used a cane before they went in the hospital, or even if they brought a cane with them, or their daughter brings the cane up to the hospital or to the rehab setting, right? We don't just leave it in the room. In fact, we consider it a safety risk if we take their mobility device that they used when they were well and just leave it in the room, sort of tempting them to use it when they may not be quite strong enough to use it. So let's go to the first basic mobility device. Obviously, it's been around for a really long time, and that would be a wheelchair. And the purpose of the wheelchair is to kind of I would say the lowest energy expenditure and the lowest motor requirement to get from one place to the other, meaning I can be really, really debilitated. But if I can, either through the assistance of somebody else or myself, kind of get hoisted from my bed to the chair, I'm now suddenly in the chair, and assuming that this is a regular or what we call a manual wheelchair without any power or motor attached to it, I really just need a little bit of arm strength and a little bit of leg strength, and I can probably get to the dining room. So I kind of think of it in those terms. Of course, more recently, there are power chairs, but we don't tend to use those in this population because power chairs can be dangerous. They can run into walls or other people. So in order to use power wheeled mobility, you typically need to have really, really good cognition, really, really good vision and motor control of the chair itself. And those chairs can weigh several hundred pounds. And so the idea that we're sort of just going to slap on a motor to most of these chairs is not the way that we think. In some cases where somebody gets really good at wheelchair mobility and they just need a little extra boost, sometimes that could be considered. But when I am talking about wheelchairs in this population, in our geriatric population, we are really, really focused on manual wheelchairs. And that just means not powered. So they're powered manually. Manual means hand. So powered by their own hands or the hands of somebody else. And just generally thinking about wheelchairs, one of the quickest ways to tell that the wheelchair is meant to be self-propelled. Self-propelled means that that person is propelling it with their own hands, or to be pushed by a caregiver is to see if the bars are coming off the back. So if there are metal bars coming off the back of the wheelchair, that typically signals, hey, either that wheelchair was bought on Amazon and that's just the way it looked. That's like the chair I got from my grandmother. Or that person either all the time or occasionally needs the assistance of somebody pushing their chair from the backside. And what is really funny to me, and I just saw this recently in a TV show, is we always get this wrong on TV. I don't know why, but there will be somebody who is maybe paraplegic, meaning like they're paralyzed from the waist down, but they have normal preserved upper body strength and can very successfully propel the wheelchair on their own, if not better than the people around them. And they still have the bars coming off the back. People that are really adept, especially younger people that are using wheelchairs, typically won't have those bars coming off the back because they're propelling their own chair and don't need the assistance of somebody pushing them from behind. So the next time you're watching anything on TV, look for the bars on the back. I always find that funny that I would see like maybe a 25-year-old who's got huge biceps and shoulders, like having somebody push them from behind. The only reason that somebody will push you from behind for the most part is when that person is fatigued or unable to push themselves. Otherwise, especially in the rehab world, we want that person pushing themselves. We want that person propelling the wheelchair. It's great exercise. It's great for range of motion. It's great for mobility. So anyway, okay, that's my little like diatribe about TVs and wheelchairs. And also, okay, sorry, one more thing is they never fit the person. I don't know why. I'm just watching whatever I'm watching. It's like, where did they get this wheelchair? It's usually ridiculously too big for them, or like just the whole type of chair is completely inappropriate for whatever disability that they are proposed to have. And so I feel like there's this prop guy who just has this 1978 wheelchair in the closet somewhere and just busts it out every time there's a storyline about a wheelchair. But yeah, so that's one problem of rehab professionals watching, modern TV. Anyway, so wheelchairs, let's just talk a little bit more about those. In thinking about a wheelchair, you really want to understand the purpose of the chair. Like, is this going to be something quick to get from, say, the car to the doctor's appointment? Or is this going to be somewhere where the patient is anticipated to spend a lot of time? Because if this patient is expected to spend any more than, I would say, 30 to 60 minutes in that chair, you've got to look at the seat of the chair. The seat should have a cushion. Like, nobody would be comfortable sitting in these kind of ill-supported sling-like seats in some of these wheelchairs for a long period of time just because it's uncomfortable. And so you can tell kind of the quality and the intent of the chair primarily by looking at the seat and seeing if the seat does have some structure and cushion. Think of it just like sitting in a dining chair. Is this somewhere that we could expect this patient to sit for long periods of time? And when we're, especially in the more debilitated geriatric population, the only place that they sit other than their bed is usually the wheelchair. Because of all the effort it takes, maybe one or two staff, to get them from the bed to the wheelchair. It's not like that you're suddenly moving now to a regular chair in the dining room or going to get up and walk at that point. So most of their contact on their bottom side is going to be the bed or the chair. And so the sitting up in a chair in and of itself, And I know we take this for granted because most of us are ambulatory and walking around like normal. But if you have a geriatric debilitated person and their kind of default setting is to be lying down in bed, actually lying flat on your back or close to flat on your back, what we call supine, is very hard on the body. First and foremost, the skin. The skin on the back of the body is not meant to be in constant pressure contact with any object, even a soft bed. And you can start to get issues with skin breakdown or what we call decubitus ulcers that can form in that setting. But there's also been a lot of new information, even since I went to medical school, about the impact of lying flat on your lungs. So there's a lot of accumulation of junk in the bottom of the lungs, and lying back flat, it tends to accumulate and is much harder to expel or cough out than if you're sitting up and you have the advantage of that large diaphragm kind of popping things up towards the mouth and being able to cough out. If you're just laying on your back, it's actually very difficult to get a really strong, rigorous cough and get those secretions or the junk that's accumulating in the lungs up and out of the body to prevent things like pneumonia. Also, for your gastrointestinal system actually does like to work with gravity, right? So you eat something in your mouth and it goes through your esophagus, into your stomach, into your intestines. I mean, part of that is, there's muscles that are moving the food through the digestive tract, but it was kind of made for you to be sitting upright so that food moved down through, kind of top to bottom. And if you're lying flat on your back, it becomes more difficult for the body to move and process food from the mouth all the way through the digestive tract. And so you would get prone to things like reflux. So you would have acid in the back of your mouth. You're more prone to things like constipation because things are just not moving as quickly. So really, one of the main goals in our like I said, our heavily debilitated geriatric population is just to get them out of bed. It doesn't even really matter exactly what they're doing, but try to get them upright. And in really, really difficult patients that maybe can't even tolerate getting out of the bed, the first thing we may do is just elevate the head of the bed to get them accustomed to sitting up again. Because you can imagine if somebody laid in an ICU bed for 2 weeks, it's not easy to sit up. Even for young people, you get kind of dizzy. Your body kind of has to recalibrate, right? So we might even do training to get to the point where they can get in a wheelchair. So raising the head of the bed up and keeping it up for longer and extended periods of time to help prep them for sitting up in a chair. So anyway, I could go in about this for many hours on just wheelchair mobility, but that patient themselves is going to want to get stronger, at least with their trunk is the main thing that you're worried about. And then I would say your neck as well. I'm sure you've seen people that are placed in a wheelchair that have poor trunk and neck strength, and they almost have their forehead in their lap, like they're just kind of leaned forward, which obviously is not the most comfortable position, and you're prone for falling face forward out of the wheelchair. And so anything to kind of preserve at least a trunk strength plus or minus, hopefully some neck strength, that is really what you're going to be looking at to help keep that patient safe and sitting in the wheelchair. So that's the population we're talking about, the early users. If you think of it like a graduation, right? The very, very kind of like first use of that chair by that debilitated patient is going to be really for sitting tolerance. And at that point, most of the time, they're not propelling the chair. They're not using their arms to push the wheels. They're just doing sitting tolerance. So let's think of that as like the very first stage of mobility. And so by that point, like I said, the mobility is mostly induced by somebody moving them, but the wheelchair is the very first device that we're going to use to get somebody one place to the other. The next level, even within the wheelchair use, is independent wheelchair use. Yeah, so that you can graduate. So think of this like let's just go through these graduations since it's graduation season. So we graduate from sort of passive wheelchair use, meaning I'm sitting in a wheelchair and you're pushing me around, to I've finally got enough strength to kind of straighten up, put my shoulders back, and pull my arms into a position where I can propel the chair forward. And there are different weights of chairs. You can get lightweight chairs that are made of lighter materials that make it a little bit easier to propel forward versus those heavy metal chairs. Kind of those standard wheelchairs can weigh a lot and have more difficulty for somebody to push forward. Some ailments that might make this really difficult to use would be if a patient had a stroke and maybe only one of their arms is working, right? That can be really difficult to propel a chair, although there's some modifications and accommodations that can be made to help with that. Or maybe somebody had a fall and broke their shoulder or broke their arm. it really becomes really difficult to get them into wheelchair use. So it might knock out that possibility as a mobility device, at least at first, that they're not allowed to put any weight on the shoulder or something like that. So anyway, so remember, stage 1 is just getting in the chair and tolerating sitting in the chair. The next stage is them actually propelling the chair at longer and longer distances. And although I know there's a lot of emotional and cultural issues with using a wheelchair, which I'm going to address at the end here, when people say, well, I don't want to see my loved one in a wheelchair, they should be walking, or the patient says, I really want to be walking, I always tell them this is pre-walking. The muscles that we're using to sit up in the chair and propel the chair are the same muscles I'm going to be asking them to use when we go to a walker. Now, that doesn't include, obviously, the lower extremity muscles, but if they're helping propel their chair by kind of tapping their feet or moving their feet to help move the chair forward, that's also engaging the lower extremity muscles. And so it's pre-walking. So you can borrow that if you're trying to convince somebody that we are where we are and we just need to be in the chair for now to be safe. But it doesn't prohibit walking. In fact, you want to establish good safety and endurance with the chair before we're going to move to the next step. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on endurance. That tends to be the most limiting factor that we see. Pain as well, but endurance is probably the biggest one. And I know it'd be crazy if you're kind of running 100 miles an hour right now to think you'd be tired to get, roll a wheelchair 25 feet. But for some people, especially if they've had some sort of cardiac or pulmonary history, that's a lot. They could be completely out of breath after 25 feet. And if you're looking at that, you're thinking, this is really somebody, you can just sort of do a correlation. If this is a loved one, like this is somebody who, if they went home in this condition, would require significant amounts of care. Obviously, if they're not pushing the chair or barely pushing the chair, this is somebody who's going to need pretty much 24/7 caregiver availability, especially if they're going to need to get out of the get out of the bed to go to the bathroom, get out of the bed to go eat, etc. Because remember, being out of bed is the best thing for our digestive tract, for our swallowing, to prevent things like aspiration. So we are working on what we call sitting tolerance or wheelchair tolerance the whole time that they're in the chair. So if somebody is kind of accustomed to getting their afternoon naps after lunch, we try to push that time as much as possible because we really want to sort of harden them towards using this chair. So anyway, okay. Yeah, like I said, I could probably do a 3-hour podcast just on wheelchairs, but I'm going to move along. So after somebody becomes really confident and safe in using a wheelchair, the next device that we would attempt to graduate them to would be a walker. And a walker is sort of a generic term, and there are actually 3, there's actually dozens, but I'm going to talk about 3 specific types of walkers that you'll see and what kind of the progression is even within the walker system. So we don't go necessarily straight from, just for practical purposes, if we're following this in a linear fashion, we don't go straight from wheelchairs to walkers. A lot of times that patient will spend some time in supported standing. So they'll need to push up into what we call parallel bars, which are the 2 bars, in kind of a standing area. They might have a therapist that's holding them up with what we call a gait belt, which is to help prevent falls, or maybe even a person actually physically helping them stand. So we go from the wheelchair, we work on sit to stand or standing tolerance. And once that standing tolerance is established, then we're going to look for forward motion. So that's going to be, walking one foot in front of the other, usually starting with a couple of steps and then kind of expanding from there. And so once that patient, that's our transition, right? So that patient has gone from a wheelchair to walking in the parallel bars or walking with assistance. The next thing we would put them in usually is either a standard walker. So a standard walker just means that there are 4 posts on the bottom, and the patient would kind of lean on the top of the walker, and the 4 posts are static. There is no motion there. So they're kind of picking up the walker, putting it forward, using that as a base of support, and then advancing their legs, picking the walker up, moving it up a few inches, reestablishing their upper extremities with their base of support, and then moving their legs forward. Those actually we don't use quite as much as what's called a 2-wheeled walker. So a 2-wheeled walker is kind of a hybrid. So there's wheels. So 2 of the legs, I guess, of the walker are static, and then 2 of the legs are wheels. And this gives just a little less friction, a little bit easier to advance the walker, which means like pushing it forward, but still the stability of the 2 static legs to make sure it doesn't fall out, slip out from underneath you or just go flying. So you'll typically see somebody move into a two-wheeled walker. Sometimes you'll see them have like tennis balls on the bottom that also helps reduce the friction. And even within that, like I said, there's multiple modifications that can be made for like patients that have had a stroke and so forth. But really that's kind of our safe standard, like let's just start here. Now I'll tell you that the next level after the walker is the most popular one and usually the least safe and the hardest to get somebody to use a two-wheeled walker when they're used to using what's called a rollator. So people tend to call these walkers. I don't know if they're technically classified as walkers. They are the things that you've seen at graduation parties and football games of people coming to visit that are using what almost looks like a stroller with a seat in the front. And it has four wheels on the bottom and usually like a basket or something on the underneath. And they can push that. And then when they need to, they can turn around and sit down on it. So that is a rollator. And like I said, not really used as much in medical settings because rollators have four wheels and those wheels are almost frictionless. And so you have to have pretty good control of your mobility and pretty good awareness of what's happening as far when you're walking to be able to use that safely because it's too fast. It can just get away from you really quickly. And in fact, when my grandmother fell last summer, I have this image seared into my head of walking in and seeing her on the ground and then looking to the right and seeing the rollator. And she said, it just came out from underneath me. And we have hard floors in the house, which is supposed to help with mobility so you can get around easier than carpet. But the downside is there's not any friction. So it's very easy to lose control of a rollator. Now, rollators have been godsends, I know, for many people and families that they're very useful in the fact that they provide an area to sit down if you're fatigued, whereas a walker does not. But rollators are considered beyond walkers. Like you have to have a lot more safety and mobility and cognitive reaction time as well to be able to use those safely. So you'll rarely see us using a rollator in a rehab setting because by the time you're up at a rollator, you're probably good enough to have already gone home, maybe on an outpatient basis or something like that. So in the walker world, there's the standard walker. Remember, that's like the safest and the most structured, but also the least speed, right? The least efficient thing. Then we have kind of the in-between, which is the two-wheeled walker. And then above that is the rollator. So then you'll see that much more commonly in the community. So those are sort of the structures that give you bilateral support. So that all three of those mean that I'm using my right and my left arm to hold up my upper body. And I'm kind of offloading the weight of my upper body to make it easier for my legs to move forward. These types of devices also help with things like balance or vertigo issues that, especially if they're unexpected or can come at any time, because you suddenly have, whether you're feeling off balance to the right or the left, you have a bilateral support system that could go either way. They can be difficult to travel with. Most of them will fold up. The rollators can take up an entire trunk. Some of the walkers are folding and can be kind of easily folded flat and a little bit easier to move around. And then also you have to consider the weight. And so even if somebody can get around in a rollator or a walker, it's maybe not going to be expected that they could fold it up, push it into the trunk or the back of an SUV, because some of these devices can weigh 30, 50, 60 pounds. So just have to think about that as far as independence. Whatever we are using, we just want to make sure we'll take it with us because it's not going to help if we go to the store and have that balance or dizziness issue and we don't have it with us. So anyway, that is the bilateral support. And the next, I won't call it the highest level. That sounds weird. But for somebody who has the most mobility but needs just a little bit of help, then you're talking about something worn in one hand. And so that can be what's called a single point cane, which is just basically it looks like a candy cane, like at Christmas. There really is nothing special at the bottom. There's usually a little piece of rubber just to help it stick to the ground. And then sort of, the little candy cane shape at the top. And then a hand goes on the top. Now, why somebody's using a cane, there can be lots of different reasons. It could be to offload a bad hip or knee. in which case if they have their left hip or their left knee that's really bad, typically, at least the rehab way to do it, is that when that leg is in stance, meaning it's carrying the weight, so that single point cane is really meant to provide a little bit of stability and a little bit of offloading. And so if I've got a really bad left knee or left hip, at least the rehab way is to wear that cane in the right hand so that when there's weight going on the left side, that we are offloading or putting a little bit of weight through the right hand so that there's less actual pounds going through the painful left side. You will see people kind of doing the opposite of that. So if their left hip is hurting, then they'll walk with that cane really snug against the left hip. In fact, it looks like that cane is part of their leg, like they're walking. And then when they put weight on the left leg, they're putting weight literally on the cane and the leg at the same time. Now, a lot of people have just naturally developed that. If it was done through a rehab system, they'd probably have the cane in the opposite hand, but whatever works, right? So that's a regular, what we call a single point cane. They're very easy to get even at Walmart or Walgreens. Some of them are folding canes. I've not seen a whole lot of those. I'd be really worried about that mechanism breaking down and then the cane suddenly folding. But I have heard of people taking folding canes with them, like to the store, or even something that could like go in their purse and they can kind of like an umbrella, pull it out and then expand it and then use that. So that's a single point cane. The next one is called a quad cane. So a quad cane, if you've ever seen, looks from the top up like a normal cane, but at the bottom, there's almost like four, I don't know, how would you say it, like little feet or modules that really expand the base of the cane. So instead of being a single point where it touches the ground in one spot, this kind of cane actually touches in 4 different spots. And so that's called a quad cane. It's considered more stable. It gives that person a little bit more support, whether they were leaning left, right, front, backwards, doesn't really matter, versus the smaller contact. So with a single point cane, the contact on the ground might be an inch or an inch and a half. And then when you're looking at a quad cane, those can, be like 5 by 5 at the bottom. So you have 25 square inches versus like 1 square inch of contact on the ground. So it's kind of a compromise. So a little bit more support than the regular single point cane. And you'll see those around as well. There is a proprietary cane that's been on TV a lot. And I think a lot of patients have really liked using, and this is a brand name. This is not a type of cane, but this is a brand name called a hurricane, which I always thought was a really cute name. So the hurricane is a little bit different because instead of a quad cane with kind of 4 points of contact, this is actually 3 points of contact in a triangle type setting. And the way that it's built with, I don't know if it's springs or what kind of loading it takes, but it does kind of move more smoothly than a single point cane. You can kind of have almost like the way that your foot you strike with your heel first and then move through your toes. The hurricane is similar to that. So you'll kind of have a first strike on that cane and be able to move through your walking pattern with the cane. I believe they cost somewhere around $40 or so. They are not special order or anything like that. They're available at CVS and other places like that. So that's the hurricane. So just like a very similar to a quad cane, but 3 points instead of 4. I have seen many patients with highly decorative walking sticks, and walking sticks don't really have the curve at the top. They're literally just like if you got a really large stick and just walked around kind of holding it like a soda can. These tend to be more decorative. Maybe there's something more sentimental about them. I've seen them have lots of different engraving or, I don't know, little decorations put on them. And they are not known to provide a lot of stability for almost anything. But there are a lot of patients that swear by them. They feel safer using them. But really, if you were going to go through, it provides some protection against a fall. I mean, you could just imagine carrying a big stick in your hand and feeling unstable and then, appreciating that you had this extra point of contact. But as far as absorbing, because of the way that the stick is made, it doesn't absorb any weight. It doesn't absorb any energy. It's really just there almost as like an insurance plan. If you had to just get another point of contact, if the wall wasn't nearby, you'd have the walking stick. So that's not considered kind of a formal durable medical equipment. Like nobody would order a walking stick, but I have seen people use them. And as we're about to talk about, adoption and use is the primary thing. So if that's all that they're going to use versus nothing, then yeah, So that's a really quick run through between wheelchairs, walkers, and canes. Now, the biggest problem that we face in geriatric rehab is people don't want to use them, right? There's a lot of psychology behind going from independent ambulation or walking to using a device. And understandably so, right? There's cultural assumptions about somebody who's using these devices. Maybe it signifies disability, maybe it signifies aging. I would say, in my experience, male patients tend to have a bigger concern or issue with this than our female patients. But that can be an issue. And I've seen it lead to additional falls because somebody just honestly feels like there's a pride issue with it. They just don't want to use it. Or maybe there's some stubbornness there. And that can be really hard if you're supporting an aging parent and you know the safest thing for them is to be using a wheelchair or to be using a walker, and you see them kind of stumbling around. But I mean, you can only do so much, and we can only do so much, even in a rehab setting. Even in a rehab hospital, we have patients that are really determined and then they don't use the walker, they don't use the cane, and they end up falling. And so the cultural issues around it is something that I would encourage us to be able to talk about. And hopefully the providers are talking to them about it, but their family as well. And one of the ways I like to think about it is this can be bridging us to a future, more functional self. And I always go back to falling is 10 steps backwards in every single situation. You have a new fracture, you go to the hospital, even if you spend 6 hours there, that's a step backwards. Nobody feels good being in the ER for 6 hours. And so I always talk about it in terms of preserving our future mobility. Preserving the option to walk without the device is walking with the device now. And sometimes you can kind of get some buy-in from that, kind of having this vision of, I see you, I'm going to meet you where you're at, and you want to walk without this device. I want you to walk without the device as well. The least restrictive environment for you may be walking without anything. But at this moment, to preserve even that option, we've really got to get you safe and almost like getting us into a training system. So I'll often talk about walkers as our training system, just like I talked about with the wheelchairs. Okay, this is just the prep, right? Everybody can relate to that. There's some point in your life where you trained for something. And so this walker is keeping us safe while our muscles come back online. So I'm almost always telling my patients when I meet them, I'm so glad you're here in rehab. We're going to change your spark plugs, rotate your tires, get you back on the road. And what I'm trying to convey to them is that there's kind of this intermediate period where we're going to have to use things we don't normally use or do things we don't normally do to kind of get back on the road and be safe. And so I would talk openly about it if that's something that works for your family, and be excited about the use of the device, not as something that's going to restrict them, but it's literally the opposite. That device is helping to keep them independent. So I wanted to talk about some kind of quirks about these devices. One, especially for the canes and the walkers, is to be aware and work with a professional who can make sure that they're adjusted correctly so they're at the right height. A lot of these they're adjustable in various areas, especially the wheelchairs. And so if you can work with a therapist or somebody who can even do measurements and try to make sure the device is right, especially if it's going to be a longer term device that you're going to be using. The other thing is these can get pretty expensive. And I don't know why it's set up this way, but if the patient is in a hospital or a rehab setting, at least through Medicare, they can't be issued the equipment until they're discharged. And so that can create some complications. So you're trying to use the equipment that the facility owns or the rehab department owns to train that patient, but you can't actually get that patient-specific equipment until they leave. And it's just a weird thing. I've seen some scenarios where they even let patients go home for 3 days after the hospital just so they can acquire their equipment. This is a billing issue, not a medical issue, and then get into a rehab system after that. I don't recommend that, but I know in some cases that's the best option. And you have to be aware, and I don't know all the ins and outs, but Medicare only covers certain levels and types of equipment. If you get into more advanced equipment, especially with power mobility or some of the more expensive devices, you might have some issues there. I remember many years ago really having a hard time getting Medicare to buy the wheelchair for my grandmother, and I don't know how much time was spent trying to get this arranged. I don't know why it was so difficult, but at the end of the day, I threw my hands up and found one on Amazon for like $70. better than nothing for sure, and ended up getting that. So the other thing is these do require maintenance. And one of my regrets, although I don't know that it would have changed anything, is I was not paying attention to the maintenance for the rollator that Nana was using when she fell. And after she fell, just because of my own brain and how it works, is I went and grabbed the rollator and realized that the brakes were not great or had failed. I don't know that that's why she fell. I know that she fell because she was extremely sick from a bleed in her stomach and probably lightheaded. But I remember feeling regretful that it didn't even occur to me to check the brakes on that. She had never mentioned an issue with the brakes, but they were faulty for sure. And so I think we kind of assume that once we buy these devices, they're good forever. They do break down. They're just like anything else. They have flaws at times, and they do need to be replaced and maintained over time. So maybe not a walking stick. Those tend to last forever. And I've seen some that have walking sticks that their dad gave them or their mom or whatever. So anyway, but for those other devices, especially in devices that have wheels, those can have issues. So just to be aware that this is, if the hospital isn't issuing a wheelchair to somebody, this is why. If you're in an outpatient basis, I know I talked a lot about somebody being in a rehab program, but that's probably the exception more than the rule. And if you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, they've had a couple falls or a couple close calls, what's the right thing to do next? And I would highly encourage what's called a gait evaluation or mobility evaluation with a physical therapist. And that can be ordered through a primary care physician. In some states, you can have direct access to physical therapy. I know here in Texas, I think you can do an evaluation and up to something like 10 visits without a doctor's order. And those are the specialists. Those are the ones who can make sure that you're getting the right equipment, getting trained on how to use it safely, and getting good objective advice about what would be best. And so if you're trying to convince a loved one to use a cane or a walker and they don't, there's some distress in that situation or some friction, then really getting that kind of third-party physical therapist, and sometimes it's even just 1 or 2 visits. I'm not talking about, some 12-week session thing. Like, this is a physical therapist doing an assessment about what the safest device is for that person. And so that's the way I would access it, through a professional. And of course, I know a lot of families, including my own, sometimes you just buy it and try it, right? So you try the walker, see if that works. If not, move on to something else. And so at the end of the day, I think Nana got away with using that rollator up until she fell. She was 90 when that happened and really hadn't used a wheelchair much except for what we call community mobility. And so it's very common that you might have one device you use around the house, like just to get from point A to point B in the house, and then have a different device that you use out in the community. And that could just be because of endurance. Like, hey, if we're going to have to go way far down this parking lot to get to the doctor's office, a walker might not be the best choice. You might have to have a wheelchair for that situation. And then vice versa. Sometimes you don't use a device in the home, but when you leave, you might grab a cane or something like that. But I will tell you one other anecdote that I've heard from so many patients is that they lose their canes in the shopping carts. And so I have this idea that the grocery stores must have this back room filled with people's canes because they tend to just leave them in there. I don't know how. I think they hang them on the side because once they get in the grocery store, they're using the shopping cart for stability. Like, they don't need the cane because the cart is basically a large walker, right? And that cart has bilateral stability, meaning your right and your left hand is getting help. And so you can't really use a cane and push the cart at the same time. It doesn't work like that. And so they end up putting the cane in the cart because they have to use a cane to get to the front of the store to get to the cart. And then the cane is gone and they have trouble finding it. So anyway, so you are managing a grocery store. I'm dying to know if you actually just have a large collection of canes somewhere and people that just give up on them, or they just have like almost disposable canes, like reader glasses, like they just have a bunch of them because they need it all the time. I don't know. So yeah, so be aware of leaving it in the grocery cart. So anyway, I know there's a lot more we could talk about on the topic. I've been droning on long enough. I hope that was helpful. I hope that you feel a little bit more educated and prepared, at least for the device selection. If you have somebody who is moving into using a device, that is a point where they need a lot of understanding and patience and support, positive attitude, empowerment type language. This makes you safer. This makes you more independent. This makes you able to do more things. And you can be part of just helping change the culture and the stigma of using a mobility device. Like I'm hoping there's a day where that's just considered the same as using glasses, right? It's something that makes you more functional and more independent. So anyway, I hope that was fun, and I appreciate you listening, and I will see you soon. Thank you so much. Hey everyone, it's Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to take just a moment to review the disclaimer. This podcast is for informational and occasional entertainment purposes only. Nothing discussed here is formal medical, legal, or financial advice. By listening to the podcast, we are not creating a patient-doctor relationship between you and myself or any of the guests. Really, it's just me and a possible guest or two, sometimes three, sitting around talking about difficult topics related to aging parents. If you have or suspect that you might have a medical problem or condition, you should seek advice from a licensed medical professional. If you have any questions or concerns, please read the full disclaimer in the show notes or contact me directly. Thank you again for joining us today. I can't wait to see you next week. Have a good day.